Do you miss your grandmother?
I do actually, yeah, I do miss my grandmother. And my grandfather, particularly being in Windsor. For me, Windsor is hers. Sometimes I'd come round and have a bit of tea with her because she had the best teas ever, so I used to get well fed.
There are moments in royal history that unfold not with the crash of ceremony and public proclamation, but with the quiet, almost surgical precision of a sealed envelope changing hands. February 2026 gave us one of those moments. And when the dust settled, Prince William stood as the sole inheritor of properties and trusts so historically significant, so legally airtight, and so deliberately structured that even the most seasoned constitutional scholars paused to take stock of what Queen Elizabeth II had quietly engineered from beyond the grave. This is not a story about wealth, though the estates in question are worth a considerable fortune. It is a story about foresight, about the nature of stewardship, about the quiet fury of those who believed they had positioned themselves well, only to discover that the Queen had been watching all along and had already answered every move before it was made. To understand why this matters, we need to go back, not just months, but decades. Queen Elizabeth II was, by every account of those who served closest to her, a woman who thought in generations, not quarters. She had witnessed the unraveling of European monarchies. She had watched the press reshape public perception of the royal family in real time. She understood, perhaps better than any living person, that the survival of the institution she had dedicated her life to depended not on charm or popularity, but on the careful, unglamorous work of legal protection, moral clarity, and choosing the right people to carry the weight forward. By the mid-2010s, she had made her assessment. The royal family, as she saw it, was at a crossroads. Prince Harry had shown signs of fracture that would eventually become a public rupture. Prince Andrew's association with controversy had cast a long shadow that no amount of public relations management could fully dissolve. And closer to the throne, in the corridors of Clarence House, she observed something that troubled her. A quiet but persistent appetite for commercial opportunity, dressed in the language of heritage. The Queen was not naive. She understood that the monarchy had to modernize. She had no objection, in principle, to the royals adapting their approach to public engagement, farming, sustainability, or cultural patronage. What she did object to, according to those who knew her well, was the conflation of royal legacy with private commercial ambition. The difference mattered to her. The difference was everything. And so, quietly, methodically, and without fanfare, she began to build. The first thing you need to understand about the properties at the heart of this story is that they do not appear in any standard register of Crown Estate holdings. They are not Balmoral or Sandringham, which are well documented and widely discussed. These estates exist in a different legal category entirely, acquired privately over decades, managed through personal sovereign discretion, and protected by legal instruments that are not subject to the usual parliamentary or institutional oversight. Among them is a property in the Chiltern Hills that has been in the family's private possession since the wartime years of King George VI, a man who understood the value of having sanctuaries untouched by politics or press. This estate was not ceremonial. It was not for public engagement. It was, by design, invisible, and its contents, archival records, private correspondence, and materials of extraordinary historical significance, were tended with a quiet reverence that very few people were ever permitted to witness. Prince William was one of those few. From around 2017 onwards, he began making private visits, not in an official capacity, not accompanied by cameras or public statements, but as a young man genuinely invested in understanding the history he was being asked to inherit. He spent time reviewing wartime documents. He helped with archival maintenance. He walked the grounds with the Queen during her later years, listening more than speaking, absorbing the weight of what he was being shown. Those who were present during those visits describe a quality in William that they found unusual for someone of his position. He was not performing stewardship, he was practicing it. And Elizabeth noticed. In 2020, Queen Elizabeth executed a private legal instrument, witnessed by her personal solicitor and a constitutional advisor, establishing what is known as a covenant trust. This is not a standard form of royal estate management. A covenant trust of this nature is a deeply personal legal construct designed to transfer property and custodial responsibility under specific conditions to a named individual outside the normal mechanisms of crown succession. The conditions attached to this trust were precise. They would be triggered only upon the completion of the Queen's state funeral and the formal recognition of Prince William in his role as heir to institutional responsibility. Both conditions were eventually met, and when they were, the transfer was executed without drama, without negotiation, and without any legal avenue for challenge from outside the named bloodline. The February 2026 announcement was brief, it was factual, and for those paying close attention, it was unmistakable in its implications. Prince William had received not just a property, but an entire carefully constructed legal fortress built around him by a woman who had spent years thinking about exactly this moment. The reaction inside certain parts of the royal household was not gracious. Queen Camilla, who had by this point established herself in her public role with considerable skill and whose public profile had softened significantly since the difficult years following Princess Diana's death, had been quietly building a parallel vision, not for the monarchy as an institution, for herself and for her son. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, is by training and public reputation a food writer and culinary enthusiast. He has authored several books on British food culture, and his public persona is that of a passionate advocate for artisan produce, seasonal ingredients, and the kind of honest, unpretentious cooking that feels genuinely English. There is nothing objectionable about that on the surface. But behind the public persona, a different kind of ambition had been quietly developing. According to people with knowledge of discussions taking place in late 2024 and into 2025, Tom had been exploring the commercial potential of certain royal-adjacent properties with a seriousness and a specificity that went well beyond casual interest. The vision, reconstructed from internal documents and the accounts of people familiar with the conversations, was substantial. Luxury retreats, high-end dining experiences, heritage branding built on the prestige of royal associations. Investors were being approached, holding companies were being registered, feasibility studies were being commissioned. None of this was explicitly illegal, but all of it depended on something that had not yet been confirmed as available: access to estates that were not his to offer. Camilla, meanwhile, had been pursuing her own version of this vision through the language of cultural patronage. Proposals for what were described as heritage centers, literary gatherings, and culinary celebrations of rural Britain circulated in advisory circles with enough frequency that they came to the attention of people loyal to the Queen. The proposal, examined carefully, looked less like cultural stewardship and more like the groundwork for a rebranding exercise that would place Camilla and her family at the center of something that had been built over decades and at significant effort for a very different purpose. The Queen, as it turned out, had anticipated precisely this. One of the most remarkable features of the Covenant Trust and the associated legal instruments Queen Elizabeth put in place is the degree to which they appear to have been drafted not merely as standard inheritance documents, but as specific responses to anticipated challenges. There are clauses within the trust documentation that explicitly bar any material transformation of the estates for commercial purposes without the express written consent of the named beneficiary. There are provisions that nullify challenges brought by individuals who entered the family through marriage rather than bloodline. There are conditions attached to specific parcels of land that restrict their use to educational, environmental, or archival purposes, with the beneficiary acting as sole guardian of that restriction. When legal analysts reviewed these provisions in light of the commercial proposals that had been floating around in advisory circles, the conclusion was unavoidable. These were not generic legal protections. They were targeted ones. Elizabeth had watched what was developing, had understood where it was headed, and had built a wall around it years before the first proposal was formally drafted. The word that circulated among constitutional scholars reviewing the documents was not admiration, exactly, though there was plenty of that. The word was preemption. The Queen had preempted every move before the game had properly begun. Prince William's response to all of this was, characteristically, not public and not theatrical. He did not give press conferences. He did not release statements of outrage or victory. He did not engage in the kind of visible family conflict that tends to generate headlines and damage the institution he was working to protect. What he did was sign charters, activate trusts, walk with his children across estates that were now formally in his care. He let the legal architecture do the talking, and it spoke with an authority that no personal statement could have matched. There is a quality to this that those who have studied his public conduct over the years will recognize. It is not passivity. It is the kind of disciplined restraint that requires more self-control than most people appreciate. When provoked, his instinct appears to be not to escalate, but to anchor, to return to the principles he has been trusted to uphold, and to act from that position rather than from emotion. This is, by all accounts, exactly what his grandmother saw in him. Not ambition, not hunger for profile, not the need to be seen winning. The capacity to hold something carefully, to understand its value without needing to exploit it, and to protect it even when that protection requires standing against people you are related to and expected to love. The specific estates involved in this transfer represent, taken together, something more than a collection of valuable properties. They represent a deliberate vision of what the monarchy should look like going forward. Some contain archival materials of genuine historical significance, documents, recordings, and correspondence that illuminate the private workings of the institution in ways that no official history has ever fully captured. These are not materials with commercial value in the way that a luxury retreat or a branded food product has commercial value. They have a different kind of value. One that is cultural, historical, and entirely incompatible with the hospitality industry applications that were being imagined for them. Others are environmental holdings, protected woodlands, and agricultural land that carry conservation obligations stretching back generations. Their value is not extractable. It exists in their being left largely as they are, managed carefully, kept out of the cycle of development and exploitation that has consumed so much of rural Britain over the past century. And some are simply places of meaning, properties where the Queen spent time in private, where her grandchildren played, where the weight of public life could be temporarily set down. These are not grand in the way that Buckingham Palace is grand. Their significance is interior, emotional. The kind of significance that cannot be bottled or branded or turned into a 5-star weekend experience without being destroyed in the process. Elizabeth understood this. William understands it. And that shared understanding is, in many ways, the through line of this entire story. By the time the dust had settled in the first weeks of February 2026, the picture that emerged was a clear one, even if the individual details remained partly obscured by the discretion that governs these things. Queen Camilla had watched as properties she had internally designated as opportunities were formally and irrevocably transferred away from any influence she might have exercised over them. Tom Parker Bowles, whose commercial proposals had been progressing with what must have felt like real momentum, found himself without the access or the endorsement that would have made them viable. Holding companies registered in anticipation of deals that would never materialize were quietly dissolved. Events that had been planned were canceled. Statements were issued that were notable chiefly for how little they said. The back-channel lobbying, the legal probing, the heritage reclassification arguments, the attempts to establish precedent for shared custodianship. All of it had run directly into a legal framework that had been specifically designed to make all of it impossible. King Charles, whose position throughout this period was one of careful distance, reportedly made clear in private that any attempt to challenge the legal validity of the Queen's instruments would be treated as an assault on the integrity of the institution itself. This was not a threat made publicly. It did not need to be. The message was received. It is worth pausing here to consider what Queen Elizabeth II actually achieved through this series of legal instruments, taken as a whole. She did not simply leave properties to her grandson. That would have been legally straightforward, but also legally vulnerable. Standard inheritance, even royal inheritance, can be contested. It can be subjected to reinterpretation. It can be chipped away at over time by people with resources and motivation. What she did instead was far more sophisticated. She constructed, over a period of years, a set of interlocking legal mechanisms that together created something approaching an impenetrable framework around the future she wanted to protect. Each instrument reinforced the others. Each anticipated a specific category of challenge. Each was notarized, witnessed, and filed in ways that made retroactive challenge extraordinarily difficult. This is not the work of someone who was simply dispensing property. This is the work of someone who understood that the people best positioned to undermine a legacy are often the people closest to it, and who took the trouble to build walls accordingly. The question of whether it was kind in a personal family sense to do this is a separate one, and probably not answerable from the outside. Families are complicated. The royal family, subject to pressures and scrutiny that most families never encounter, is more complicated than most. But from the perspective of the institution's long-term integrity, what Elizabeth did was not merely defensible. It was arguably necessary. She had watched over 7 decades what happened when commercial ambition and royal legacy were allowed to intermix without strict governance. She had seen the damage that resulted to reputations, to relationships, and to the public's trust in the institution itself. She was not willing to leave that vulnerability intact for future generations to navigate. For Prince William, the inheritance is not only material. He has received properties of historical and environmental significance. He has received a financial buffer built quietly over decades that gives him genuine independence of operation. He has received the legal authority to act as sole guardian of some of the most important private archival materials in the country. But he has also received something that cannot be valued in pounds or measured in acres. He has received a documented, irrevocable expression of trust from the woman who knew the institution better than anyone alive. She did not simply leave him things. She built a structure around him that says, in the clearest possible legal and personal terms, that she believed he was the right person to carry this forward. That is not a small thing. For someone who has spent his adult life in the full visibility of public scrutiny, who has navigated grief and family fracture and the relentless pressure of inheriting a role that most people would find impossible, to have that trust made explicit and permanent is significant in ways that go well beyond the properties themselves. There will be those who read this story and focus on the conflict, on the commercial ambitions that were frustrated, on the family tensions that were made visible, however briefly, on the maneuvering and the legal probing and the holding companies dissolved after the fact. But that reading misses what is most interesting about what happened here, what Queen Elizabeth II demonstrated through this entire sequence of actions, is that the monarchy's greatest asset is not its properties, or its public profile, or its constitutional position. It is the quality of judgment brought to bear on decisions that no one outside the family will ever fully see. The decisions made in private correspondence. The choices made about who to trust and what to protect. The willingness to do uncomfortable things, including building legal walls around your own family members in the service of something you believe matters more than any individual's preferences. That quality of judgment and the willingness to act on it even when it is personally difficult is exactly what she appears to have seen in William. And it is exactly what she appears not to have seen or not to have trusted in others. In the weeks following the February 2026 announcement, William made a series of visits to the estates now in his care. He went without press, without extensive entourages, with his family, and with the kind of quiet deliberateness that has come to define the way he moves through the private dimensions of his role. He was photographed once, briefly, walking with his children along the edge of a lake at one of the properties. No statement accompanied the image. None was needed. The children were curious, asking questions that children ask about history and land and the meaning of belonging to something larger than yourself. He answered each one with patience, with the unhurried quality of someone who has thought carefully about the answers and is not performing for any audience. This is, in the end, what legacy looks like when it is working. Not the grand proclamation, not the ceremonial transfer, but a father walking with his children across land that was entrusted to him by someone who loved him, explaining what it means and preparing them to understand it in their turn. Queen Elizabeth II spent decades watching, assessing, preparing, and when the moment came, she did what she had always done. She acted with precision, with foresight, and with an absolute certainty about what mattered most. The estates are William's now. The mission that came with them is one he has been preparing for, whether he knew it or not, since those first private visits to a hidden archive in the Chiltern Hills, filing wartime letters in a chamber no camera would ever film. She chose him because she saw, in the quality of that quiet, unglamorous, entirely voluntary work, exactly the thing the monarchy needed most. Not ambition, stewardship. And in the end, that distinction made all the difference.